Hi there and welcome. Power Automate Desktop allows you to pass variables from one flow to another, which is pretty good because it allows you to actually, compartmentalize your code, which is good from a code efficiency point of view. You can actually have one flow that does the work that could be called by other flows. The problem is that when you want to pass just one or two variables into another flow, that's okay. But what if you wanted to pass, let's say, 20 or 30 variables into that desktop flow? Well, that could be a little cumbersome. In today's video, I'm going to show you a way to be able to do it that's scalable and very, very efficient to be able to maintain. So let's get into it. Okay, so for this demonstration, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this sample application that I created, just a standard customer information collection form that's got the basic information of first name, last name, email, and phone. So what I've already done is I've already pre-prepared a desktop flow that will enter information into this browser application. So here's the flow. I've got it in the background here called add customer information. And this is the web page that it's going to interact with. So what it's basically going to do is it's going to get a handle to that to the browser, the action number one, and then it's going to start typing in information into this form here. Now you'll notice that for each one of the actions, it's got for the first name, the last name, and then the email, it's actually hard-coded the values. If I double-click on any one of these actions, you can see the values are hard-coded. That's on purpose, just for demonstration purposes. So when I run this flow, you'll see, I hit the run button here. It's going to open up the browser and then start populating all the fields within that application with the values that I've got hard-coded within this flow. You can see that it starts filling in information. This is standard stuff. I wanted to start with a basic, which is this is a desktop flow that's going to be called by another desktop flow. Now, you normally wouldn't do this. You would normally have it so that this particular desktop flow would accept parameters because you wouldn't want to hard code values with the desktop flow. You want to keep your steps separate from your data. So traditionally what you would do with desktop flows is you can define input variables. Now, what an input variable, for those that don't know what an input variable is, I'm going to show you one. So in the variables panel here, on the very, very top, you have input, and you can define either input or output variables. For our demonstration purposes, I'm going to define an input variable, and we're going to call this input variable, let's call it first name. Or sorry, yeah, first name. Okay. We're going to leave the data type as text. The default value is going to be Brad, and the external name is going to be first name. And hit save. So there's an input variable there. Now what you would traditionally do is wherever that input variable is going to be used within your desktop flow, and for example in here for action number 2, this is where I'm actually filling in the first name in this field right here. Let me just reset the fields here. And so now I'm going to remove the hard-coded value and I'm going to replace it with the input variable. First name. Now hit save. Now, because it's defaulted as Brad as the default value, when I'm running it in design view, it's going to use that value. If I was calling this desktop flow, there'd be an input variable panel that would pop up that allows me to enter the information. I'm just going to leave it. I'm going to run it in design view right now, so I can demonstrate that it's how the input variable works. So I'm going to hit publish to be able to save my changes. And let's run it. Now it should behave exactly the same way as it did before. All right, and now let's hit run. Again, it'll open up the browser application and then start filling in the fields. See, filled in the first name, and it's going to do the remaining fields. That part hasn't changed at all. Now, for this particular form, there are 13 individual fields in here. First name, the last name, email, phone, and so on and so forth. Now, what I could do is I could define an input variable for each one of those fields. I'm just going to start with 3. I'm going to say the last name, leave it as text, and I'm going to put my name, and last name. Hit save. Now we got two input variables, and I'm going to add in the email. Email, leave it as text. Default value. And email. Hit save. So now I've got three variables. I've already defined the first name, but now I can replace the hard-coded values with the input variables. So instead of hard-coding my last name, I now use the last name input variable and do the same thing for the email. Like that. Okay. And I'll publish it to save the changes. So now you can see that there's three input variables. There's 13 possible input variables for this particular desktop flow, but I've only defined three. So now, if I was to exit this, if I run this desktop flow, it's going to prompt me for those three input variables. I've already got them defaulted, so I could just click OK. And again, the flow is going to behave exactly the way it did before. It's going to open up the application, open up the browser that it's already there, and then start filling in the information. Oh, sorry, let me reset that. I'll stop it. Reset the form and try it again. Play. As expected, opens up the form and then starts filling the information. The first three variables were input variables and the rest of them were hard-coded. Okay, and then it's completed successfully. However, you start to see that, if you only had 1, 2, 3, maybe 5 input variables, you could probably get away with it because there's not that many. 13, you start pressing it. When you start having 20 or maybe 25 or 30 or maybe even some instances where you have larger variables that you need to pass around into a different desktop flow, it can get cumbersome after a while. So let me show you a better way to be able to do it. The one that I've used, and it's been proven that it's very, very efficient and very, very scalable and easy to use, kind of, to be able to pass in a single variable that has multiple values or multiple variables in it. Let me explain what that means. All right, so first we go back into design view. Okay. Okay, now we're back in design view. Now, if I was to go back into the to list the input variables, I've got my three input variables there. I'm going to erase these. I'm going to get rid of these. Delete. Power Automate's going to complain because now my flow is referring to variables that don't exist anymore. So let me just delete these. Okay. And let me put it back to the way it was. Hard-coded. Just temporarily. And the last one. Okay, there's where we're back to where we were before. No input variables, everything's hard-coded. Now, as I kind of teased, you can actually have it so that I can pass in all 13 of these variables into this desktop flow using one single variable. Now, let me show you how you can do that. So again, the same process is the same. Click on input because I want to define an input variable. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call this variable name, I'm going to call it customer. And the external name is also going to be called customer. Now, this data type here, by default, you can it'll accept a text, but you can also have it so that it accepts a number, a Boolean, and all these other ones. But you'll notice that there's one in here called custom object. Now, what a custom object is basically one single object that can actually be nested with other variables within it. Well, let me show you what that is. So if I'm going to define this as a custom object, okay? Now again, I still have a default value, but now I've got a button here that says edit. Now the editor allows me to actually create a table of a custom object, which is a name value pair. So a custom object is basically a collection of name value pairs. So click on edit. So I got my name and I got my value. So let's start with the first three that I did before, which was first name, last name, and email. And I'll put the values in it as well. Like that. Hit save. So now it's created a custom object with 3 rows, 3 name value pairs, and the 3 name value pairs are first name, last name, and email. And those are the values, Bradera, and Bradera@gmail.com. Hit save. Now that I define that as my input, leave it as it, leave the input variable as is. But now I want to replace the actions with the data that's inside of this custom object that I've just created. How do I do that? Well, similar to before, as I delete the hard-coded value, now I'm going to see a customer object as my input variable, customer. However, underneath customer, there are those 3 name value pairs. There's the first name, the last name, and then email. To be able to access those name values pairs, the name basically is you put a dot and then you put in the name of the variable, first name, like that. So that would represent one of the names in the name value pair, first name. Copy this, save it. Do the same thing for last name. And the email. Okay. Push it. And this should work exactly the same way it did before. Let's try it out. Let's make sure our form is reset. It's reset. All right, let's run it. Okay. It's behaving exactly the way we expect it to. It opens up the form and starts filling the information. The first 3 fields that I filled in were not hard-coded. They are actually defined within that custom object. So now we've got a way to be able to have an input as a single object. Rather than having 3 separate input variables, I now have a single custom object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the other 10 variables into this one single custom object, and I'm going to fast forward, and I'll be right back, and you'll see that this custom object will have all of the variables that are required for this form. Be right back. Okay, now I define the rest of those name value pairs for this particular desktop flow. First name, last name, email, all the way down. So there's 13 of these names, and then the values are associated with it. So now I've got my one single customer object that has all the data that's required to be able to enter information into this form. Save. Now I just have to replace the hard-coded values with the values in the custom object. So I'm going to do the first one here for phone, similar to how I did it before. It's customer, because I've only got the single object, and dot phone. Okay. Now to save time, I'm just going to do it for the rest of these. I'll be right back. Okay, so now I've replaced all the hard-coded values that's within this desktop flow with a reference to that custom object. You can see all the variables have now been replaced, and there's no more hard-coded values in this flow at all. Everything comes in from a single custom object, and again, I'll just remind you what it looks like. This is what the customer custom object looks like. Name value pairs. Now, I'm going to run this. The form should behave exactly as it did before. It should start filling in the information top to bottom, starting with the first name, the last name, and then work its way down. Okay, so it looks like it's doing what we expected to do, which is to fill out this form. Okay, so now we've modified this desktop flow so that instead of having to define 13 input variables, it can be just boiled down to one single input variable, but it's a custom object. Okay, so the next step is to be able to have it another flow called this flow. Now, before we do that, I'm just going to go back to the input variable. And for the default value where we've already set up the information, click on edit. Now it's got these name value pairs. Okay. Now in the desktop flow that we're about to create, that's going to call this one, we're going to need this information. Now there's an easy way and then there's the hard way. The hard way is just to be able to recreate this custom object in the other flow. Or there's a little slider in the top right hand corner called JSON editor. This is the secret. Okay, click on that, and what it's going to do is it's going to return those name value pairs as a single JSON string. So we're going to need this. I'm going to copy this entire JSON string. It'll make sense in a moment here as why I'm doing this. So I copy this. So that this custom object, its name value pair, has now been you can specify it as a JSON string. So cancel out of here. I'm going to publish this. Now I'm going to open or create a new test flow. This is going to be the flow that's going to call the add customer information desktop flow we just created. It's called test flow. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new subflow called, setup variables. Okay. And then I'm going to create another subflow called setup customer. These subflows will make sense in a second here. My main, what I want to do is I want to call the setup variables subflow, and then I want to call the setup customer subflow. But before I do that, remember the JSON that I copied? Well, we're going to put that into a variable. Called JSON. Paste it in there. Okay. And then we're going to use another action, and it's right here again under the variables section within the actions. It says convert JSON to custom object. So we're going to take that action, put it underneath here. And what we're going to do is we're going to convert that JSON string that we just copied from the other flow, and we're going to produce an object called customer. And the object, the variable is JSON. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run it from here just to make sure that it does create the custom object we expected based upon this JSON string. So run from here. All right, so we have in our flow variables here, customer. If I open up customer, we now see we have name value pairs, first name, last name, email, phone, and so on and so forth. Okay, all the variables that were collected from the other desktop flow. Okay, so now what we can do is in our main, we can say call run subflow. Let's call the setup variables first. Okay, and then we want to call the run desktop flow. Now the desktop flow that we want to run is the customer information flow that we were just working on. Add customer information. Now it's saying, well, the input variable is a object, saying you need to provide it with a customer object. Well, we're going to define it, but we've defined it already. It's called customer down here. We pass in this. Push. Okay, so now we've saved our flow. Let's see if it runs. Hit the run button here. Now, what it should do is it should behave exactly the way it did before, as if I was calling the original add customer information desktop flow. Sets up the variables. It's calling that other desktop flow now, and it should, the browser should pop up, and it should start filling in information just like it did before. And it's done. Okay, so now what we need to do is one more thing. See, the setup variable, it's actually taking this particular set variable with the JSON that was copied from the other desktop flow. But what if we wanted to be able to have it so that this test flow specified its own variables or another its own data? We don't necessarily want to have to do JSON and specify it here. Well, first thing we need to do is we need to change this and reformat this JSON variable. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put each name value pair on its own line. All 13 of these name value pairs. And we're going to put the curly brace below it. Okay. So basic name value pairs. You got first name and then the value. Okay. Last name and the value. So what I want to do is I want to blank these out. So to blank them out, I'm just going to leave the double quotes and just put in, replace the value and then hit the delete key. So what I'm just going to have is name value pairs of, it's got the names, but it has no values. And for the phone, because it treated it as a number, I'm going to put it in double quotes like that. Okay. And just delete the rest of these. Okay, hit save. Now, when I run from here, it should still continue to create the custom object, but in the custom object that it creates, it'll create all of the names, but all the values are going to be blank. And that's kind of what we want for right now. I look at that object. It's got all the names, but no values. Okay. So you remember I created this other subflow called setup customer? Well, this is where you would actually be able to set the variables with whatever information that I wanted for this particular flow. In order to do that is I have a set of set variables. And I'm going to say set variable. First one is going to be customer, but it's going to be first name dot first name, which is one of the 13 names that we have in our custom customer object. And we're going to put in Joe. All right, and now I'm going to do this another one. I'm going to do the last name. And I'm going to say Smith. Okay. All right, so I've only done 2. I'm going to do the rest of them. So I've done all 30 of them. I'm going to skip through this, and then I'll show you what this particular subflow will look like after I've identified all of the name value pairs and the values. Okay, be right back. Okay, so I finished completing the rest of the variables setup in the setup customer. It's got values for all 13 of the name value pairs within that customer object. Now, in order for this to work successfully, I just have to go back to my main subflow, and I have to run the subflow for setup customer. So I'm just gonna copy and paste this. Change this to setup customer. Publish. Now what it should do is it should call the subflow to set up the variables, which is basically set up create our blank custom object essentially. And then the next step is to run the subflow setup customer. This is where we use that blank customer object and fill it in with the information that we want to specify to create this customer. And then the third step is to actually call the other desktop flow. And in that desktop flow, we're actually passing in the single custom object called customer. Let's see if it works. Okay, so it's opened up the form and it's starting to fill in information, the information that we specified in this calling desktop flow, and fills it in, and it is now complete. So to recap, if I go back to our original Power Automate desktop flow, add customer information, now you can have it so that you have one single input variable, a custom object that can contain as many different main name value pairs that you want. In this case, I had 13 in here. You could have 20, 30, 50, as many name value pairs as you want, as all contained to a single object that can be passed into this from any other desktop flow. In this case, this is what it's going to look like when we specify the desktop flow, a single object. So it's more scalable, more easy to maintain. That's it. See you next time.